Hi, this is Allison from threesistersfabric.com. I wanted to share a video with you today because we've been using this method around our studio an awful lot lately. It just seems like certain patterns have become more popular, more usable. I don't know, is it with the advent of some of the more modern quilts maybe? We're just liking some simplistic patterns, just lines and more geometric. But the thing that's happening a little bit is that the patterns stitch out really fast from row to row. And so we're having to tie off. We get to the end of a row, and we have to tie off. We have to hit OK. The machine goes back. It relocates for the next row, and it stitches that row out awful fast. And it is causing us to have to babysit the quilt a little bit too much, for our liking anyways. I kind of like my machine to run a little bit. I don't really want to spend all my time tying off and clicking OK. If I can set it all up and it can run and be happy, and I can sit there and work on some other sewing project, or maybe setting up the next quilt in standalone mode, or whatever all is going on there in our studio at the moment, it's really nice to let the machine do the work. So here's the way we've tackled this problem. It works really nice. It takes a few minutes of setup time, but it saves you a pile of quilting time. So I have a couple patterns loaded here. I'm going to show you both methods. The first one I'm going to work with here is with a pattern called Modern Drift Edge to Edge. That is a pattern that's available on my website, and I'll include a link to that in the video. But for now, let's go ahead and set up a quilt. I'm going to set it up in repeat patterns because I am in standalone mode here. Oftentimes in the studio, we use edge to edge mode rather than repeat patterns, but either way works. Let's just say I'm coming up with a hypothetical quilt here, but my quilt is going to be 60 inches wide. It is going to be 70 inches tall. And because I do know this pattern, I want a negative 1.5 inch vertical spacing, because this particular pattern stitches out really well with a negative spacing. When I click OK, that's going to go out onto the quilt with 28 rows. That's 28 times the thread has to be tied off. You have to click OK, and the machine has to go back to the beginning of the row, tie off again, and start the next row. And you can tell by the shape of this pattern, that's going to stitch out fairly fast. It's not going to take terrible long. It's a really neat pattern. You do want to take note that there are 28 rows. That's an important thing to remember. You'll have to come back to that again in a little while. Did you notice what I just did? I drew a box around the first row of patterns, and I started from the left-hand side. If you start from the left-hand side, the only thing that will be selected are the patterns that are completely encompassed in that box. You'll notice row 2 is not completely encompassed. Only row 1 is encompassed in the box. If you go from the right-hand side, anything that the box touches is going to be selected. And that's not what we want right now. We want only the first row to be selected. So I select the first row, I right-click, and I hit Combine Patterns. Then I select the second row, and I right-click. Notice that I've only got the second row completely encompassed in the box. I right-click, I click Combine Patterns. The next thing I do is I want to connect the rows so that my machine turns around, comes down, stitches, and it goes back and stitches this row out. And I even want it to go down and start the next row. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use Alt-L on my computer, and my end snap is on. You can do that by hitting the E on your keyboard, or you can click on the little E at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to draw a line in the direction that I want the machine to sew. There's the first line. I right-click so that I can make a space, and then down to the next pattern. When it exits out of the second row of patterns, where I want it to start and hit the next row, that third row of patterns, which we're not really going to mess with right now. Now I need to click F8, because the problem that we're going to run into is that this will be the first thing I want it to stitch. F8, I need to remember, 0 is always the first. Okay, and it exits out where it turns blue here. But see, that's number 496. We want that to be the next thing it stitches. So there's the first row, the first thing that will stitch. Here's the next thing that will stitch. I'm going to click on this arrow to turn the direction around because right now the patterns are stitching from left to right, and I want this row to stitch from right to left. So I click on the arrow to turn it around, and then I click on the number to make that the next thing that gets stitched. Now I scroll back out and scroll back in, and I come over here to fix that number so that that is the third thing that stitches out. I hit F8 again to accept those changes. And now I'm going to be very careful that I do not select the third row of patterns. I only want the first row, the second row, and those two little lines to get selected. And I right click on that. And I export the pattern as a CSQ, and I'm going to export it to a test drift. I'll just call it, oops, drift. Okay, now I have a whole new pattern. That is the width of my quilt. The other thing we have to measure is we have to find out how far we need to inset the rows. And it's a really easy way to do that here. While the end of the snap is on, I start at the end of that pattern, and then I'm going to go turn the end snap off, and I'm going to go up to the very top point of this pattern here. And if you look down here, my height is 1.97. That tells me how far each row needs to be inset in order for these end pieces to connect. Now watch what happens on the next screen. I'm going to make a new quilt group. I'm selecting this new test pattern. Repeat patterns. My vertical spacing. I like to do the vertical spacing first. Creative Studio seems a little bit happier if you do that. And 1.97 was the vertical spacing. And then the rows. How many rows did we need? Half of 28 is 14 because we're doing 2 rows at a time. So 14 times 2 is 28. And look at that. My patterns all lay out. Look, the total height came out at 70.57. And the reason for that is this little line right here hangs down a little far. If that just annoys you and you don't want to see that, we can click on nodes, hit the D, and get rid of that line. Now watch this. 70.11. That's just because of the spacing being a little bit different here. But see my rows? See there's a little tiny gap, but Creative Studio won't even know it. It'll just stitch that continuously. So if you want it to be exactly 70 inches, you can turn your freeze aspect off and change that to 70 inches. And now it's perfect. It's exactly what you wanted it to be on your quilt. But the really, really cool thing is it's not going to stop and tie off at all, ever, until you need to actually turn the quilt. It will stitch out the whole table. If your table is this wide, it's going to go as far as it can possibly go all in one pass. Well, not one pass, but the passes will all be connected. That's what's pretty cool. Watch this virtual stitch out here. I'm going to speed it up a little bit so we can get to the end of the row quicker. See that? Just looping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Nice and easy. Now let me slow it down as it gets to the end so you can watch it turn around. Watch this as it comes up, goes down, and it starts the next row in the reverse. But watch what happens as it gets to the end here. This is where it's really cool because instead of even stopping at a row, it's going to stitch out the entire quilt table. There you go. It starts the next row, and it won't stop until you get to the belly bar. So I find that to be super duper convenient, a very, very convenient way to get a quilt stitched out super fast. Okay, so now I want to show you how to do the same thing with a pattern that's a little bit different. On Modern Drift, that's kind of a simple, basic pattern. The only thing that was a little different is that we had to use a negative vertical spacing from row to row. When it comes to a clamshell pattern, then we have to alternate the pattern, and I just wanted to show you how I was going to handle that as well. I'm going to create a new quilt group, and get started. Okay, so I've selected this clamshell minuet. That's another pattern that stitches out very fast. The clamshell feather stitches out pretty quickly too, but this one's just a little bit faster, and I thought it would work out nice for the video. Let's go ahead and set up another hypothetical quilt here. I'm going to make this quilt 60 inches wide also, and I want it to be 64 inches long this time. The reason for that is because I really want to end up with an odd number of rows. I want to show you how that works. This pattern also needs a negative spacing of 1 inch, 1 negative inch, but the other thing it needs is alternating spacing. Okay, watch what happens if I don't alternate it. They just stack right on top of each other and it looks not very nice. But if I alternate it and I put the plus row on top, I get a super nice repeat. That looks pretty good. Nice traditional looking pattern that will stitch out very fast, but it will be very inconvenient because again, you'll be tying off and hitting start and stop all the time, and we want this thing to stitch out fast. So just like before, we're going to do the same thing. Okay, we're going to take note that there are 31 rows in this quilt. 31 rows. All right, then I'm going to select the first row of patterns. I'm going to right click and combine those patterns. Then I'm going to select the second row of patterns and only the second row of patterns. I'm going to right click and combine those patterns. Then I'm going to use Alt L again with my end snap turned on. And I'm going to connect the first row to the second row. Right click because I don't want to make another line at this moment. I want to come over here and make my next line and go to the second row and connect it to the third row. Then I'm going to right click twice to exit out of my line drawing mode. If you don't like the straight line, you can use Alt A and do an arc, and then it will make a nice pretty arc instead of a straight line. But these kind of patterns have to be stitched off the edge of the quilt anyway, so I don't usually worry about that. Let's go ahead and F8 again to set our numbering. 0. Come on over here and change this to a 1. That arrow is coming out the wrong way. We want to change the direction, so we're going to click on this arrow and make it go the other way. And then also click the number, so it is the next thing that gets stitched out. I'm zooming out, then I'm scrolling back in to select this so that is the number 3, or actually it's the 4th thing that is going to be stitched. Then I'm selecting F8 again on my keyboard to accept those changes. Let's select the first 2 rows and those 2 end patterns. Look how nice and clean that was. First row, my end line, the second row, and that line right there. And I'm going to export that pattern. Okay, and I'm going to call this one Test Clam. Just a quick, easy little name there. Okay, but then again, the same thing. We have to take note of how far the pattern, the next row, needs to be nested. So I'm going to go Alt M on my keyboard, and I'm going to click at the end point there. And I'm going to take the end snap off, and I'm going to click at the top of the next repeat. At the top of the next repeat, and I found out that my height is 1.01. 1.01. Then I know how far I have to nest these so that these endpoints will match up again. Okay, let's start a new quilt group. I select my new Test Clam pattern. That is the width of my quilt now. By putting in that negative vertical spacing, I like to put that in first too, also because then my brain does not forget it. If I didn't write it down, I can usually remember it right away. And then the rows. Okay, remember there were 31 rows. But we can't do 31 rows now because we're doing 2 rows at a time. So we have to pick the next number up. The next even number up is 32. So 32 divided by 2 is 16. Going to make this a little bit long right at first. 16 times 2 is 32. And if you see my total height, it's a little bit longer than we expected it to be. We wanted our total height to be only 64 inches, right? Okay, we put it on the screen with those settings, and we don't have to alternate it this time because the pattern itself, we made it alternate all on its very own. Okay. All right, so now anyways, this is all quilting out row by row by row. It's nice and easy. Okay, but the only problem is it's too long, right? Yeah, we're at 65 inches instead of 64 inches. Well, that's because we have 32 rows instead of 31 rows. The easy way to fix that, go to your last row, right-click on it, and say Nodes. And then let's take it off. Let's take off that last row. Hover your mouse right over that one right there where this line starts to connect you to that next one and say D to delete. Select that row and get rid of it. Now, 63.94 or 93. If that 7/100th of an inch bothers you, unfreeze your aspect, change it back to 64 inches, and you have your quilt all ready to stitch out in one fluid motion. I hope you guys really enjoy this. It has really made things go faster and smoother and much easier around our studio. Have a great day! And if you enjoy the video, please consider purchasing the patterns. That is my greatest inspiration to continue making more videos and more patterns. You can find the link to the patterns used in this video below the video. Thanks for watching!